The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning when the October rain drummed against my kitchen window like impatient fingers. Heavy cream paper, the kind that whispers money before you even break the wax seal. Gold lettering that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill spelled out words that made my chest tighten. Rebecca Marie Chen requests the honor of your presence at her marriage to David Alexander Sterling III. The third. Even his name came with a pedigree. I set the invitation on my scarred wooden table, next to the stack of unpaid bills and the framed photograph of Sarah, my late wife. Rebecca looked just like her mother in that picture, all brightness and stubborn hope, back before life taught us that hope sometimes comes with a price tag we can't afford. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the yellow walls closing in like they were embarrassed by their faded paint and water stains. Through the thin walls, I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door yelling at her television in rapid Spanish. The familiar sounds of my neighborhood. Honest sounds, real sounds, but somehow they felt insufficient in the face of that elegant invitation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd raised Rebecca in this house after Sarah died, working double shifts at the construction site to keep the lights on and food on the table. Every scraped knee, every report card, every teenage heartbreak had happened within these walls. But looking at that invitation, I wondered if she remembered any of it with anything other than embarrassment. The phone rang, cutting through my thoughts like a buzzsaw through silence. Rebecca's voice bubbled through the speaker, excited and breathless, the way she used to sound on Christmas morning when she was 7. "Dad, did you get the invitation? Isn't it gorgeous?" David had them designed by this incredible artist in Soho. Each one is practically a work of art. Of course he did. Everything with David was custom-made, imported, exclusive, designed by someone with a single name and a waiting list. Even my daughter's happiness seemed like something he'd ordered from a catalog of experiences, available only to those who could afford the premium package. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I managed, my voice steady despite the storm brewing in my chest. The same voice I'd used to read her bedtime stories, to calm her fears during thunderstorms, to tell her everything would be okay when her mother died and our world collapsed into grief and uncertainty. "There's just one tiny thing, though," she continued, and I heard the shift in her tone, the careful modulation that meant she was about to ask for something she knew I wouldn't want to give. "David and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if you kept things kinda low-key at the reception. You know how you get when you start telling those construction stories, and his family is very sophisticated. They might not understand the humor. Sophisticated. The word landed in my stomach like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of hurt outward until they reached every corner of my being. I'd heard variations of it before, refined, cultured, educated, all polite ways of saying I didn't belong in the world my daughter was entering. I had spent 32 years swinging a hammer, laying foundations, building houses that would shelter families for generations. My hands were scarred from honest work, my back bent from carrying loads that men like David Sterling III would never touch. Every callus told a story of problems solved, structures built to last, families given a place to call home. But apparently that made me unsophisticated. "I understand, Rebecca," I said quietly, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. Understanding meant I could see how a man who'd never worked with his hands might look down on those who did. Accepting would mean agreeing that his perspective was correct. "I knew you'd get it, Dad. You always do." Relief flooded her voice. "This wedding is so important to David's career, you know? There are going to be partners from his firm there, potential clients, people who could really help our future. I just want everything to be perfect. Perfect." Another word that had lost its meaning, somewhere between the daughter who used to help me in my workshop and the woman who was embarrassed by the smell of sawdust on my clothes. After we hung up, I walked to my workshop in the garage, seeking the comfort of familiar tools and the honest smell of wood and oil. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows across workbenches that had seen decades of projects, birdhouses for Rebecca's school fundraisers, a dollhouse that took me 3 months to build for her 8th birthday, shelves for her textbooks, a jewelry box I'd made when she graduated high school. In the corner sat a rocking chair I'd been working on for months. Cherry wood, hand-selected from a lumber yard in Pennsylvania, where the owner still knew every tree by name. Every joint had been fitted with the patience that comes from decades of practice. Every curve sanded by hand until the wood felt like silk under my fingertips. I'd started it the day Rebecca announced her engagement, thinking it would make the perfect wedding gift, a place where she could rock her future children, tell them stories about their grandfather who built things to last. But looking at it now, under that harsh light, it seemed suddenly inadequate, humble, unsophisticated. Not the kind of gift that would impress David Sterling III or his sophisticated family. I ran my fingers along the smooth armrest, feeling every grain of the wood, every hour of labor that had gone into its creation. Sarah would have loved this chair. She would have understood the love carved into every joint, the hope sanded into every surface. But Sarah was gone, and Rebecca was marrying a man who measured worth in dollar signs and social standing. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed like a slow-motion disaster. Each phone call from Rebecca brought new instructions, new ways I needed to modify myself to fit into her new world. My hair needed to be cut shorter. The slight curl that Sarah had loved apparently looked unprofessional. My suit needed to be pressed at a dry cleaner, not just hung in the bathroom during a hot shower like I'd always done. Even my shoes, polished to a mirror shine, weren't quite right. They were work boots, sturdy and honest, but not Italian leather. "It's just for one day, Dad," Rebecca said during one of our increasingly strained conversations. After that, things can go back to normal. But I was beginning to understand that normal was never coming back. This wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a graduation, Rebecca's final step into a world where I would always be the embarrassing relative, tolerated but never truly welcomed. 3 days before the wedding, I made a decision that surprised even me. I walked into Henderson's Formal Wear, the fancy shop downtown, where mannequins posed in tuxedos that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. The salesman, a thin man with perfectly styled hair and shoes that had never seen a construction site, looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "I need a tuxedo for my daughter's wedding," I said simply. He quoted a price that made me wince, but I nodded anyway. Sarah's life insurance money had been sitting in a savings account for years, earning modest interest while I lived off my pension and Social Security. If Rebecca needed me to look the part, I would look the part. The tuxedo fit perfectly after alterations, transforming me into someone I barely recognized in the mirror. The man looking back at me could have stepped out of a magazine, sophisticated, refined, every inch the father of the bride that David Sterling III's family expected to see. But beneath the expensive fabric, I was still Frank Chen, a man who'd raised his daughter with calloused hands and an open heart, who'd built tree houses and dried tears and worked overtime to pay for piano lessons and college tuition. The tuxedo was just a costume, and I'd never been good at playing dress-up. The wedding was held at Riverside Manor, a sprawling estate that overlooked the Hudson River, like a monument to old money and older privilege. I arrived an hour early, partly out of habit and partly because I needed time to steel myself for what lay ahead. The grounds were immaculate, gardens that probably employed a full-time staff, fountains that sparkled in the late afternoon sun, walkways lined with flowers that bloomed in perfect formation. Cars began arriving as I stood near the entrance, each one more expensive than the last. Bentleys and Mercedes, a few Ferraris for the younger crowd, license plates from Connecticut and Manhattan and the Hamptons. Men in perfectly tailored suits stepped out with women whose jewelry caught the light like captured starlight. These were people for whom money wasn't a concern. It was simply another tool, like a hammer or a saw, except their tools built portfolios instead of houses. I watched them greet each other with air kisses and practice smiles, conversations flowing in the coded language of the wealthy, mentions of recent trips to Europe, updates on summer houses and winter retreats, casual references to charitable donations that probably exceeded my annual income. Rebecca appeared at the top of the manor's grand staircase, and for a moment, time stopped. She wore Sarah's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, but still carrying the ghost of my wife's beauty. Sarah's grandmother's pearls glowed against her throat, the only piece of our family's modest heritage that seemed worthy of this grand stage. When she saw me, her smile faltered for just a heartbeat, not from joy at seeing her father, but from something that looked dangerously close to surprise, as if she hadn't quite expected me to clean up so well. "Dad," she whispered, pulling me aside behind one of the massive marble columns that lined the entrance. "You look different. Good different," she added quickly, but I caught the underlying message. Different enough to pass, different enough not to embarrass her. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "Just like your mother on our wedding day." Something flickered in her eyes at the mention of Sarah. Guilt, maybe, or homesickness for a simpler time when love mattered more than appearances. "Dad, about the seating arrangements," she continued, her voice dropping to that careful tone I'd learned to dread. "David's family has very specific traditions about how these things work. The bride's family sits on the left, the groom's on the right, but there are also considerations about, well, about who sits where within each section." I waited, knowing what was coming. "We thought it might be best if you sat toward the back." "Not the very back," she added hurriedly, as if that made it better. "But David's grandmother has very particular ideas about protocol, and some of his family's business associates will be in the front rows, and—" She trailed off, unable to meet my eyes. The back. Where the unsophisticated belonged. Where the embarrassing relatives could be acknowledged without being prominently displayed. I nodded slowly, feeling something crack inside my chest. Not my heart exactly, but the careful hope I'd been nursing that maybe, just maybe, I still had a place in my daughter's life that wasn't defined by shame. "Of course," I said quietly. "Whatever makes you happy." I kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of expensive perfume that had replaced the simple vanilla lotion she'd worn since high school, and took my assigned place in the back pew of the chapel. The ceremony was a masterpiece of coordination and expense. Flowers arranged with military precision, not the wildflower bouquets Sarah and I had picked from roadside meadows, but exotic blooms flown in from God knows where, arranged by artists who probably had waiting lists longer than my mortgage. Music floated through the air, performed by a string quartet whose instruments probably cost more than my truck, their melodies as perfect and cold as everything else in this marble cathedral. David stood at the altar in a tuxedo that made mine look like a rental costume, his smile as practiced and polished as his Italian leather shoes. Everything about him screamed breeding, education, success. The kind of man who'd never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries, who'd never worked a day of overtime in his life, who treated respect like something he could purchase with the right words and the right connections. When the minister asked who gave this woman in marriage, I stood slowly, my voice carrying further than I'd expected in the hushed space. "Her mother and I do," I said, the words coming from some deep place where Sarah still lived, where the two of us were still partners in the magnificent project of raising our daughter. David's eyes flicked to me for just a moment, and I saw it. Not hatred or even dislike, but something worse. Indifference. To him, I was scenery. A necessary prop in the theater of Rebecca's past, something to be acknowledged briefly before being forgotten entirely. The reception was held in the Manor's grand ballroom, a space that belonged in a museum rather than someone's home. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across walls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, men and women who'd probably never worked a day in their lives, but somehow managed to look down on everyone from their gilded frames. Round tables draped in silk and lace seated guests who spoke in the hushed tones of people discussing art auctions and charity galas, family compounds in Martha's Vineyard, and ski lodges in Aspen. My table was in the far corner, positioned behind a massive floral arrangement that blocked most of the view of the head table where Rebecca sat with her new husband. My dinner companions were a collection of David's elderly relatives and family friends, people who nodded politely when introduced, but made no effort at conversation beyond commenting on the weather and the beautiful ceremony. I watched Rebecca from my partially obstructed view, radiant in her happiness, dancing with David to music that probably cost more per song than I used to make in a day. She moved gracefully through this world of wealth and privilege, as if she'd been born to it instead of raised in a two-bedroom house where the heating bill sometimes went unpaid in January. Maybe this was where she belonged. Maybe David was right to see me as something from her past that she'd outgrown, like training wheels or picture books or the simple dreams of a working-class childhood. The dinner was a work of art, tiny portions arranged like paintings on plates that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I ate carefully, hyper-aware of which fork to use for each course, grateful for the etiquette lessons Rebecca had given me during one of our increasingly formal phone conversations. The food tasted like expensive nothing, beautiful to look at, but somehow lacking the substance of a real meal shared with people you actually cared about. Conversation at my table was polite and meaningless, the kind of social lubrication that wealthy people seemed to excel at. Comments about the weather, compliments on the ceremony, carefully neutral observations about the beautiful venue. No one asked what I did for a living, and I didn't volunteer the information. In this crowd, saying you were a retired construction worker was like admitting to some exotic disease. As the evening progressed, I found myself studying the faces around me, trying to understand this world that Rebecca had chosen over the one where she'd grown up. These were people who'd never worried about money, who treated luxury like oxygen, necessary and abundant and never worth thinking about. Their children went to private schools and elite colleges, spent summers at exclusive camps and winters on tropical beaches, grew up expecting the world to accommodate their desires rather than learning to accommodate the world's limitations. It wasn't that they were bad people necessarily. They were just people who'd never had to be good in the ways that poverty teaches you to be good, resourceful, grateful, aware of how quickly comfort can disappear and how precious ordinary moments really are. The speeches began as dessert was served, delicate confections that looked like jewelry and tasted like air. David's best man told polished jokes about prep school adventures and summers in the Hamptons, stories that painted a picture of a life where the biggest challenges were which yacht to take to which island. Rebecca's college roommate shared memories of shopping trips to Paris and spa weekends in California, adventures funded by trust funds and family money. Everyone laughed at the appropriate moments, applauded with the precise enthusiasm that good breeding demanded. The speeches were perfect, polished, and completely devoid of the messy reality of actual human experience. Then David stood, his champagne flute catching the light from the chandeliers above. He was handsome in the way that money and good genes could make a man handsome, tall, confident, with the kind of smile that had probably opened doors since he was old enough to walk. "Thank you all for celebrating with Rebecca and me tonight," he began, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to speak and be heard. "As we begin this new chapter of our lives, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the people who helped shape the remarkable woman I was lucky enough to marry." He spoke eloquently about Rebecca's achievements, her MBA from Columbia, her rapid advancement at the marketing firm, her natural grace and intelligence. Each word was carefully chosen, each compliment precisely calibrated to impress the audience with both his wife's accomplishments and his own good judgment in choosing her. But then his eyes found mine across the crowded room, and something shifted in his expression. Not malice exactly, but a kind of calculated condescension that made my skin crawl. "And of course," he continued, his smile never wavering, "we must acknowledge Rebecca's father, who taught her the value of simple pleasures. In a world that can sometimes feel overwhelming in its complexity and sophistication, it's important to remember that happiness can be found in the most humble circumstances. Rebecca learned from her father that contentment doesn't require wealth or status. Sometimes the greatest joy comes from appreciating what little you have. Simple pleasures, humble circumstances, what little you have." Each phrase landed like a carefully aimed insult disguised as a compliment, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart exactly, but the careful composure I'd built over months of swallowed pride and bitten tongues. Around the room, heads turned to locate me, faces wearing expressions of polite sympathy mixed with subtle superiority. "Poor Rebecca," their eyes seemed to say, "having to overcome such humble beginnings. How admirable that she's risen so far above her simple origins." I saw Rebecca's face go pale, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. She knew. She knew exactly what her husband had just done, how he'd painted me not as a father to be honored, but as an obstacle to be overcome, an embarrassing reminder of a past she'd transcended. Her eyes found mine across the room, and I saw something there that hurt worse than David's casual cruelty: shame. Not shame for him and what he'd said, but shame for me. Shame that I was her father, that my simple life and honest work and working-class background were things she had to explain and apologize for and ultimately overcome. That's when something inside me broke. Not broke apart, but broke free. 32 years of swallowed pride, of accepting less than I deserved, of allowing other people to define my worth by the size of my paycheck or the brand of my shoes. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet ballroom. Conversations died mid-sentence as every eye in the room turned to watch the simple man, the humble father, the embarrassing reminder of humble beginnings. My footsteps echoed as I walked between tables, past faces that watched with the fascination people reserve for car accidents, horrified but unable to look away. I felt oddly calm, as if I'd finally stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't and remembered who I'd always been. I stopped in front of the head table, looking up at David's confident smile, at Rebecca's terrified expression, at the sea of faces that had already judged me and found me wanting. "You're right, David," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. I did teach Rebecca about simple pleasures, like the pleasure of building something with your own hands that will last for generations, the pleasure of keeping your word even when it costs you everything you have, the pleasure of loving someone so completely that you'd sacrifice your own comfort for their happiness. David's smile flickered slightly, uncertainty creeping into his eyes for the first time since I'd met him. "But there's one thing I forgot to teach her," I continued, reaching into the inside pocket of my rented tuxedo. "I forgot to teach her the difference between a man who earns respect and a man who demands it, between someone who builds others up and someone who tears them down to make himself feel bigger." I pulled out a small velvet jewelry box, not expensive or sophisticated, just honest. Inside lay Sarah's wedding ring, the simple gold band I'd carried close to my heart every day since she died, warm from my body heat and worn smooth by 28 years of marriage. "This was your mother's," I said, looking directly at Rebecca, speaking to her as if we were the only two people in the room. "She wore it for 28 years, through good times and bad, through poverty and sickness and all the challenges that real life brings to people who don't have trust funds to cushion the fall." I placed the box on the white linen tablecloth, next to the crystal glasses and gold-rimmed plates and all the expensive symbols of a life I could never have provided. "It's not worth much by your standards," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Maybe $200 at a pawn shop, less than David probably spent on his boutonniere, but it represents something that all the money in the world can't buy, a love that grows stronger instead of weaker when times get hard. A partnership built on respect instead of convenience. A life shared by two people who chose each other not for what they could provide, but for who they were." The silence in the room was complete now, broken only by the soft clink of ice settling in forgotten drinks and the distant sound of traffic on the river road below. "Your mother and I didn't have much," I said, my eyes locked on Rebecca's face, seeing past the expensive makeup and professional styling to the little girl who used to sit on my workbench and hand me tools. "But we had something these people with their summer houses and Swiss bank accounts will never understand. We had a love that made us richer every day we spent together." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears that threatened to spill over her carefully applied mascara, and I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Recognition. Not of who I was, trying to be for her sake, but of who I'd always been. "A man who truly loves you would never make you ashamed of where you came from," I said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "He would honor your father, not humiliate him. He would see your history as something precious to be treasured, not something embarrassing to be overcome." David's face had gone from confident to calculating to something approaching panic. The room full of his friends and business associates and sophisticated family members was watching him be lectured by a simple construction worker, and his carefully maintained image was cracking like ice in spring. "Now, wait just a minute," he began, his voice losing its smooth control. "This is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" I interrupted. "Is treating your wife's father like something you scraped off your shoe. What's inappropriate is making the woman you claim to love choose between her husband and her heritage. What's inappropriate is standing in front of all these people and describing my life, a life spent loving and protecting and providing for my daughter, as something to be pitied." I turned back to Rebecca, who had risen from her chair and was staring at the ring box as if it contained everything she'd lost when she entered this glittering world of wealth and status. You don't have to choose between loving me and loving him, I said softly. But you do have to choose between being proud of who you are and being ashamed of where you came from. Between marrying a man who celebrates your strength and marrying one who sees your past as a weakness to be hidden. The tears were flowing freely now, cutting tracks through her makeup, and she looked more beautiful than she had at any point during this perfect, expensive, soul-crushing day. "Dad," she whispered, and I heard the little girl she used to be, the one who would run to me when she skinned her knee, who trusted me to fix anything that was broken, who believed I was the strongest, smartest, bravest man in the world. She picked up the ring box with trembling hands, held it against her heart like a lifeline, connecting her to everything she'd thought she had to leave behind. "I'm sorry," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I'm so sorry." David reached for her hand, his voice sharp with disbelief and growing desperation. "Rebecca, you're being emotional. Your father is obviously upset about something, but this is our wedding day. These people are here to celebrate our future together." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and I saw the moment when the scales fell from her eyes, saw her recognize the difference between a man who loved her and a man who saw her as an acquisition, a trophy, a step up the social ladder. "What future?" she asked quietly. "The one where I pretend my father doesn't exist? Where I'm ashamed of the man who raised me? Where I become someone I don't recognize so I can fit into your world?" "Our world," David corrected sharply. "The world you chose when you said yes to my proposal." Rebecca shook her head slowly, and I saw Sarah in her expression, the same stubborn strength that had gotten my wife through 28 years of marriage to a simple construction worker, the same fierce loyalty that had made her defend our small life against anyone who suggested it wasn't enough. "I chose love," Rebecca said. "At least, I thought I did. But love doesn't make you smaller. It doesn't make you ashamed. It doesn't require you to hide who you are or where you came from." She slipped her mother's ring onto her finger, next to the massive diamond engagement ring that suddenly looked gaudy and cold by comparison. The simple gold band fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 20 years to come home. "I want to go home, Dad," she said simply, and I understood that she wasn't talking about the apartment she shared with David or the life they had planned together. She was talking about the small house with the faded yellow kitchen, where love had been measured in bedtime stories and homemade Halloween costumes, and a father who worked overtime so his daughter could have piano lessons. "Let's go home," I said. We walked out of that crystal palace together, past the shocked faces and whispered conversations and the massive floral arrangements that would be thrown away tomorrow. Behind us, David called her name, his voice cracking with disbelief and wounded pride, but Rebecca never looked back. The photographs would be awkward to explain. The gifts would have to be returned. The marriage would have to be annulled. But as we stepped out into the cool October evening, breathing air that didn't smell like forced orchids and expensive perfume, none of that mattered. In my truck, driving through the city streets toward the modest neighborhood where she'd grown up, Rebecca rolled down the window and let the night air mess up her professionally styled hair. She twisted both rings on her finger, the massive diamond and the simple gold band, and I could almost see her weighing their different meanings. "Dad," she said as we stopped at a red light, "I forgot something important." "What's that, sweetheart?" "I forgot that simple doesn't mean less. It just means real." I reached over and squeezed her hand, feeling both rings warm under my palm, the cold perfection of purchased love and the worn warmth of something earned through decades of partnership and sacrifice. "Welcome home, Rebecca," I said. "Welcome home." The light turned green, and we drove toward the house where she'd learned to ride a bicycle and bake cookies, and believed that a father's love was the most valuable thing in the world. Behind us, the lights of the manor grew smaller in the rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness and distance. The next morning, I woke to the sound of someone moving around in my kitchen. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. It had, been years since anyone else had been in this house in the morning, years since I'd heard the familiar sounds of breakfast being prepared by hands other than my own. I found Rebecca standing at the stove, still wearing the slip she'd worn under her wedding dress, now covered by one of my old flannel shirts. Her elaborate hairstyle had been replaced by a simple ponytail, secured with a rubber band she'd found in the junk drawer. The expensive makeup had been scrubbed away, revealing the face I remembered, freckled and honest and beautiful, in a way that didn't need enhancement. She was making pancakes from scratch, the way Sarah had taught her when she was 12, measuring ingredients by instinct rather than recipe. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and butter and home, like Sunday mornings when we were still a complete family. "I forgot how good this feels," she said without turning around, as if she'd sensed me watching from the doorway. "Cooking in a kitchen where every pot and pan has a story, where the coffee mug you're drinking from is the same one you've used for 20 years. I poured myself coffee from the ancient percolator that Sarah had bought at a garage sale in 1987, sat at the table where Rebecca had done homework, and Sarah had paid bills, and the three of us had shared thousands of meals that cost less than one course at last night's reception. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, flipping a pancake with the same concentration she'd once brought to her algebra homework. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to build," I said, "with your own hands, your own choices, your own values." She nodded, then turned to face me with a smile I hadn't seen in months. Not the practiced social smile she'd perfected for David's world, but the real one that used to light up our small house on Christmas mornings. "Dad," she said, "will you teach me to use your tools again? I think I'd like to build something real." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw Sarah's strength shining in her eyes, alongside something that was purely Rebecca. Determination tempered by kindness, ambition grounded in authenticity, the rare combination of toughness and tenderness that comes from being loved unconditionally during the years when character is formed. "I'd be honored," I said. That afternoon, we walked out to my workshop together. The rocking chair still sat in the corner, cherry wood glowing in the autumn sunlight that streamed through the windows. Rebecca ran her hands over the smooth curves, testing the joints with fingers that remembered how to recognize quality craftsmanship. "This is beautiful, Dad," she said softly. "Did you make this for me?" I nodded, suddenly embarrassed by the simple gift in the face of everything she was giving up. "It's not much compared to what you're used to now." "Stop," she said firmly. "Don't you dare apologize for creating something this beautiful, this meaningful. Do you know how long it's been since anyone made something just for me, not bought something, not hired someone to design something, but actually created it with their own hands?" She sat in the chair testing the motion, and for a moment I saw her as she would be someday. Older, wiser, maybe rocking children of her own, while she told them stories about their grandfather, who built things to last. "It's perfect," she said, and I could tell she meant it. We spent the rest of the day in the workshop, Rebecca relearning skills she'd thought she'd outgrown. I showed her how to read wood grain, how to choose the right tool for each job, how to measure twice and cut once because good materials were too valuable to waste through carelessness. Her hands remembered more than I'd expected. The muscle memory was still there, how to hold a chisel, how to guide a saw, how to sand with the grain instead of against it. We worked mostly in comfortable silence, the way we had when she was younger, communication happening through shared focus rather than words. As the afternoon light began to fade, Rebecca set down her sandpaper and looked around the workshop, at the tools hanging in neat rows, the half-finished projects waiting for attention, the photographs of past work pinned to the bulletin board. "I never understood before," she said quietly, "what this place meant to you, what this work meant. I thought it was just a job. And now..." She picked up a piece of the wood we'd been working on, oak destined to become a bookshelf for her new apartment, whichever apartment that turned out to be, and turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight and texture of something real. "Now I understand that this is love made visible," she said. "Every piece of furniture you built, every house you helped construct, every repair you made, it was all love, wasn't it? Love for your family, love for people you'd never meet who would live in those houses, love for the idea that things should be built to last." I had to clear my throat before I could answer. "Your mother used to say that the work of our hands is a prayer. Every nail driven straight, every joint fitted true. It's our way of making the world a little bit better, a little bit stronger." Rebecca nodded, understanding flooding her expression. David never understood that. He thought work was something you did to make money so you could buy things that other people made. He couldn't imagine finding satisfaction in creating something yourself. Different people find meaning in different places, I said carefully, not wanting to poison her healing with bitterness. No, Dad. Some people find meaning in building things up, and some people find meaning in tearing things down. David. David was a tearer downer. He made himself feel bigger by making other people feel smaller. She was quiet for a moment, still turning the piece of oak in her hands. I became that too, didn't I? When I was with him, I started seeing you the way he saw. You as something to be overcome instead of someone to be honored. I became someone who tore down instead of built up. You lost your way for a while, I said gently, but you found it again. That's what matters. How do you do that? She asked. How do you forgive me for being so awful? I set down my own tools and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, seeing past the hurt to the heart that had always been good, even when it was confused. Rebecca, do you remember when you were 16 and you told me you hated me because I wouldn't let you go to that party? She nodded, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. You slammed your bedroom door so hard you cracked the frame. Called me the worst father in the world. Said you couldn't wait to grow up and get away from me. Dad, I'm sorry. Let me finish. The next morning, you came downstairs for breakfast like nothing had happened. Didn't apologize, didn't explain, just sat down and asked if I wanted you to make pancakes. Do you know what I realized that day? She shook her head. I realized that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about always coming back. You came back then, and you came back now. That's all that matters. Tears spilled over her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. I love you, Dad. I should have said that more often. I should have made sure you knew. I always knew, I said simply. Even when you couldn't say it, even when you were angry or embarrassed or trying to become someone you thought you needed to be, I always knew. We finished the bookshelf as the sun set, working by the light of the old fluorescent fixture that had illuminated thousands of hours of honest labor. When we were done, Rebecca ran her hands over the smooth surface, testing the joints, admiring the way the wood grain flowed from shelf to shelf like a river of golden light. It's beautiful, she said softly. It's real. It's yours, I said, for whatever home you build next. She looked at me with eyes that held both sadness and hope. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. I don't know where I'm going to live or what I'm going to do about work or how I'm going to explain to people why I left my own wedding reception. You'll figure it out, I said with complete confidence. You're Sarah's daughter. You're stronger than you know. As we cleaned up the workshop, putting tools back in their designated places and sweeping sawdust into neat piles, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of rightness, the sense that broken things were being repaired and lost things were being found. Dad, Rebecca said as we turned off the lights and prepared to head back to the house. Thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. For seeing who I really was even when I couldn't see it myself. For building something strong enough to last until I was ready to come home. I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling the solid reality of my daughter beside me, breathing in the scent of sawdust and possibility that clung to our clothes. That's what fathers do, sweetheart, I said. We build things to last. 3 months later, Rebecca moved into a small apartment across town, not in David's world of glass towers and doormen, but not in our old neighborhood either. Something in between, a place where she could build a new life that honored both where she'd come from and where she wanted to go. She kept David's name professionally, but went back to Chen for everything else. The massive diamond engagement ring went to a jeweler who split the stone into smaller gems. One for a necklace she wore every day, the other sold to help fund her new beginning. Sarah's wedding ring never left her finger. We had dinner together every Sunday, sometimes in her apartment, but more often in the yellow kitchen where she'd grown up. She learned to cook Sarah's recipes from memory and stories, creating new traditions that honored the old ones while making room for her own dreams and discoveries. David sent lawyers with papers to sign and offers to negotiate, but Rebecca handled it all with the same quiet strength she'd inherited from her mother. She kept nothing that hadn't been freely given, wanted nothing that had to be taken through conflict. Clean breaks heal better than ragged ones, she told me, and I recognized Sarah's wisdom in her words. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, Rebecca met Thomas at a volunteer project. a Habitat for Humanity build, where she'd signed up to swing hammers and paint walls alongside people who understood the value of honest work. He was a teacher, divorced, with calloused hands and eyes that lit up when he talked about his students. When he came to dinner, he asked about the rocking chair in the living room and listened with genuine interest as Rebecca explained how her father had built it from the cherry wood selected by hand. "You'll have to show me your workshop sometime, Mr. Chen," he said to me, and I could tell he meant it. "Call me Frank," I said, "and I'd be glad to." A year later, Rebecca wore Sarah's dress again, this time in the small church where Sarah and I had been married, surrounded by neighbors and friends who'd known her since she was a baby. The ceremony was simple, honest, real. When the minister asked who gave this woman in marriage, I stood up proudly and said, "Her mother and I do," with great joy. This time, I sat in the front row. After the ceremony, we held the reception in the church fellowship hall, folding tables covered with handmade quilts, potluck dishes prepared by people who knew how to make a little go a long way, music played by the church organist who'd been volunteering her time for 30 years. Rebecca danced with Thomas to a song played on an ancient sound system, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from being exactly where you belong. Later that evening, as the guests were cleaning up and saying goodbye, Rebecca pulled me aside. "Dad," she said, "I have something for you." She handed me a small wrapped package, the paper decorated with tiny hammers and saws, novelty gift wrap she'd found at a craft store and chosen specifically because it made her think of our workshop. Inside was a photograph in a simple wooden frame, not expensive, just honest. The picture showed Rebecca and me working together on the bookshelf, both of us concentrating on our tasks, sawdust caught in the afternoon light streaming through the workshop windows. Someone had taken it without us noticing, capturing a moment of pure contentment. At the bottom of the frame, engraved in neat letters, were the words, "Built to last." "I don't remember anyone taking this picture," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "Mrs. Rodriguez took it through the garage window," Rebecca explained. "She brought it to me a few weeks ago and said she thought I might want to remember that day, the day I came home." I stared at the photograph, seeing not just the moment it captured, but everything it represented, the bridge between who we'd been and who we were becoming, the foundation we'd rebuilt together when everything else had fallen away. "It's perfect," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "Just like you taught me," Rebecca said, linking her arm through mine. "Simple doesn't mean less, it just means real." As I write this, 5 years have passed since that wedding reception, where I stood up and spoke the truth about love and respect and the difference between building things up and tearing them down. Rebecca and Thomas have 2 children now, a 3-year-old daughter who already shows signs of Sarah's stubborn streak, and a baby son who sleeps in the rocking chair I built from cherry wood, selected by hand. The workshop has expanded to include a corner where small hands can safely learn to use small tools. Rebecca brings the children over every Saturday morning, and we work on projects together, birdhouses and toy boxes and simple puzzles cut from scraps of wood. The little girl, Anna, has already learned to sort screws by size and can identify most of my tools by name. David remarried within a year, a socialite from Connecticut, whose family tree traced back to the Mayflower, and whose trust fund could have funded a small country. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he tells people his first marriage was just a youthful mistake, a temporary detour into the world of ordinary people that taught him to appreciate his proper place in society. I feel sorry for him sometimes, not because he lost Rebecca, she was never really his to lose, but because he'll never understand what he missed. He'll never know the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, never experience the pride that comes from raising children who respect you for who you are rather than what you can buy them, never feel the deep contentment that grows from a love built on shared values rather than shared bank accounts. Some people spend their whole lives trying to climb higher, never realizing that the view from the top is just more of the same expensive emptiness they're trying to escape. Others learn that the most valuable things, love, respect, purpose, peace, can't be purchased or inherited or stolen. They have to be built brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day, with the patient craftsmanship that turns ordinary materials into something extraordinary. Rebecca learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it completely. Now she teaches it to her children, who will grow up knowing the difference between price and value, between appearance and substance, between love that demands and love that gives. And in my workshop, surrounded by tools that have shaped thousands of projects and photographs, that capture decades of honest work and love made visible through the labor of willing hands, I understand that everything I built in my life, every house, every shelf, every moment of patient teaching, was really just preparation for this. The knowledge that what we create with love survives everything that time and change can throw at it. Built to last doesn't just describe the furniture or the houses or the careful joints fitted true. It describes the love itself, strong enough to survive misunderstanding, flexible enough to bend without breaking, deep enough to anchor generations of dreams and hopes, and Saturday morning workshops where small hands learn to sort screws by size, and everything that really matters gets passed down from one heart to another. Simple doesn't mean less, it just means real, and real, as it turns out, is the most sophisticated thing of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories about the courage to stand up for what matters, the strength that comes from knowing your worth, and the love that builds families strong enough to last through any storm. Remember, respect isn't something you buy, it's something you earn. And the most valuable gifts aren't the ones that cost the most money, but the ones that cost the most love. Until next time, keep building something beautiful.